horn echoes through the frozen dark, and the snow answers with silence. Welcome, friends. Draw a little closer to the fire, for some tales are best heard while winter waits beyond the light. There are places where old vows outlive the men who swore them, where forgotten blood still calls across the ages, and where every step north carries a heavier price than the last. Come now, and listen while the long cold remembers. Snow fell beyond the wall as if the sky had been torn open and left to bleed white. It came softly at first, whispering through the black pines, then harder, thickening the air until even the trees seemed to crouch beneath its weight. Sir Alaric Crowell rode at the head of 3 rangers, his cloak frozen stiff about his shoulders and his breath turning to frost in his beard. The horse beneath him hated the dark, and Alaric did not blame her, for there were places in the haunted forest where even brave men felt themselves unwelcome. The wall was 2 days behind them, a pale memory hidden by storm and distance, and every step northward felt like a step taken out of the world of men. They had come seeking a lost ranging party, 5 brothers who had vanished after following wildling tracks near the frozen shore. That had been the reason spoken aloud in the yard of Castle Black, where men needed reasons and orders and names scratched into ledgers. But Alaric had known, even before they crossed beneath the iron gate, that this was no common search. The ravens had flown restless for 3 nights, beating their wings bloody against the cages, and the old steward who kept them had sworn they would not face north. At dusk on the first day, they had found a line of wolf tracks that ended without turning back, as though the beasts had simply stepped out of the snow and into the air. By the second night, they found the first brother. He was hanging from a weirwood by his own black cloak, though no branch above him was low enough for a man to reach. His face was blue, yet not with cold alone, and his eyes had been opened wide as if some last terror still stood before him. Garrod, youngest of the rangers, crossed himself in the Southron fashion and muttered that they should cut him down. Alaric looked at the snow beneath the corpse and saw no footprints there but their own, filling slowly as the storm gathered strength. "No," he said, and the word came rough from his throat. "We leave him until morning, and we keep the fires high." Morning brought no mercy. The corpse was gone, the rope frozen stiff where it had been tied, and under the weirwood lay a circle of blackened snow. No blood marked the place, no drag marks led away into the trees, yet the air smelled faintly of old iron and wet stone. The men said little as they saddled their horses, though silence among rangers could speak loudly enough. By noon they found the second brother, half buried in a drift, with his hands clenched around his own throat. When they turned him over, his mouth was packed with shards of ice, clear as glass and sharp enough to draw blood from Alaric's glove. The tracks they had been following vanished soon after, replaced by signs that made less sense. Branches snapped inward toward their path, not away from it, as if something large had moved through the trees while facing them all the while. A raven, dead and frozen solid, dropped from the sky and shattered against a stone. Far off, beneath the sound of wind, came a thin cracking noise like a lake breaking underfoot. Garrod whispered that the others were near, and old Clay muttered that boys were too quick to name shadows. Alaric said nothing, but he loosened his sword in its scabbard and kept one hand near the pouch of dragon glass tied beneath his cloak. Near sunset, they came upon a wildling camp in a hollow beneath a ridge of stone. The fires were dead, the hides torn down, the cooking pots overturned and frozen into the ground. There were bodies everywhere, men and women and children, but none had been butchered and none had been robbed. Their weapons lay beside them, untouched. Bone knives, stone axes, bows strung with sinew, all useless now beneath a skin of frost. In the center of the camp stood a circle of stakes, and tied to one of them was a girl of perhaps 16 years, alive, shivering, and staring at them with eyes too fierce for fear alone. Alaric dismounted slowly, showing empty hands, though the girl bared her teeth as he approached. Her hair was black and tangled with snow, her cheeks raw from the wind, and blood had frozen along one sleeve where a shallow cut marked her arm. "We are not your enemy," he told her, though he knew how foolish that sounded coming from a man in black. She spat at his boots and said, "All crows say that before they take what they want." Clay laughed once without humor, but Alaric cut the rope from her wrists and stepped back before she could strike him. The girl rubbed her hands, looked past him to the bodies, and for a moment her fierceness cracked into grief so sudden that he turned away to spare her the shame of being seen. "Her name was Vera," she said when the fire had been coaxed back to life and wrapped itself weakly around a few damp branches. Her people had been of the Frostwood, a small clan that kept away from kings, raiders, and crows alike. They had been attacked in the hour before dawn, not by men of the Watch, not by Thens, not by raiders from the ice rivers, but by dead men walking with blue eyes and broken jaws. Yet the dead had not killed everyone they found. They had searched the camp, moving from shelter to shelter, turning over bodies, listening like hounds at burrows. "They were looking for Torin," Vera said, her voice low and bitter. "My brother." Alaric felt the name settle among them like a coal beneath ash. "Why would dead men want your brother?" he asked, though the answer already seemed to be waiting somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight. Vera looked at him for a long while, weighing whether truth would serve her better than hatred. "Because old Bryn said he had the cold blood," she replied at last. "Because the trees watched him when he was born, and the ravens came without calling." Gerd frowned, not understanding, but Clay's face tightened, and Alaric saw the old ranger's hand make the sign of the seven before he remembered where they were. In the haunted forest, no god seemed near enough to answer. They found Torin's trail before the last light failed. It began beside a fallen shelter where the snow had been trampled by many feet, most human, some not. There were signs of a struggle, a broken spear shaft, drops of blood, and the deep gouges of a body dragged only a few yards before being lifted. From there, the trail ran north, not toward any wildling holdfast Alaric knew, but toward the white emptiness where maps lost their courage. Vera knelt over the marks and touched the blood with 2 fingers, then pressed them to her lips. "He was alive," she said, and the certainty in her voice was almost a command. Alaric wanted to turn back. A living commander would have ordered it, and any dead one with sense would have blessed the choice. 4 rangers, 1 wildling girl, failing provisions, and a storm sharpening around them like a blade. These were poor weapons against tails, old enough to have grown teeth. Yet the lost brothers had not vanished by chance, and the dead had not slaughtered a camp merely to carry off one frightened boy. Somewhere in the north, a purpose was moving. Alaric had spent 20 years telling younger men that fear was a lantern if a man knew how to hold it. And now his own fear burned bright enough to show him the road. They buried none of the wildlings, for the ground was iron and time was worse than stone. Instead, they gathered what food could be taken, wrapped the dead children in hides, and placed fire among the tents so the camp would not rise again behind them. Vera watched the flames catch, her face still as carved bone, while sparks fled upward into the falling snow. "You will help me find him," she said, not asking. Alaric looked north, where the trees stood close together and the darkness between them seemed deeper than night. "Aye," he answered, and the word felt like an oath made before gods he did not trust. They rode from the burning hollow as the last red light died behind the hills. Behind them, smoke climbed into the storm and vanished, carrying with it the last warmth of Vera's world. Ahead, the trail of the dead cut through the snow with terrible patience, every mark pointing toward lands where no crow returned unchanged. Alaric heard something then, far away and almost lost beneath the wind, a horn perhaps, or a cry, or the long groan of ice splitting under a hidden weight. No man spoke of it. They only lowered their heads and followed, while somewhere in the dark beyond the trees, something old turned its gaze upon them. The storm swallowed the last glow of the burning camp before midnight, leaving nothing behind but drifting ash that mingled with the falling snow. The 5 travelers rode in silence, each listening for sounds that did not belong in the haunted forest. Horses breathed hard through flaring nostrils, their ears twitching toward shadows that seemed to move even when the wind stood still. Alaric had learned long ago that beasts often sensed danger before men did, and his mare had not relaxed once since they found the abandoned village. Every few moments she tossed her head and gave a nervous snort, as though catching the scent of something too cold to belong among living creatures. The trail was unlike any Alaric had followed in all his years beyond the wall. There were footprints enough, yet they seemed strangely ordered, as if every step had been measured with care rather than taken in haste. Here and there lay the marks of bodies dragged through the snow. But those trails always ended abruptly, suggesting that the captives had later been carried instead. Broken branches pointed northward with uncanny precision, almost like signs left for pursuers to read. Clay crouched beside one such branch, rubbed the pale wood between his fingers, and frowned deeply. "No axe did this," he murmured. "The frost itself split it." Before dawn, they reached a frozen stream where the tracks disappeared beneath a skin of blue-white ice. Garrett cursed under his breath, swinging his torch from bank to bank in search of any sign. Vera slid from her horse without a word and knelt beside the stream, brushing away fresh snow with gloved hands until she uncovered a patch of darker ice beneath. There, trapped below the surface, lay a smear of frozen blood stretching toward the opposite shore. "They crossed here," she said quietly. "The river froze after they passed." Alaric looked across the stream, measuring its width, and felt a chill unrelated to the weather. The ice was thick enough to bear them now, but it could not have frozen so quickly by any natural cold. They crossed one at a time. The horses hesitated, hooves scraping against the glassy surface while the stream groaned softly beneath their weight. Halfway across, Garrett's gelding suddenly stopped dead and refused to move another step. The young ranger struck its flank with the reins, then again harder, but the animal only trembled violently, staring down into the ice. Alaric dismounted and walked back, laying one steady hand against the frightened beast's neck. Through the crystal beneath his boots, he thought he saw pale shapes, suspended in the water, motionless and white as carved stone. When he blinked, they were gone, leaving only his own reflection staring back from the frozen depths. Once they reached the far bank, the forest changed almost at once. The trees grew older, their trunks twisted into shapes that resembled bent giants frozen in endless suffering. Moss no longer clung to the bark, and even the snow seemed thinner here, exposing dark roots that clawed through the earth like black fingers. No birds called overhead, no squirrels darted between branches. The forest had become so utterly silent that every creak of saddle leather echoed with startling clarity. Toward midday, Vera suddenly raised one hand, bringing the company to a halt. She pointed toward a rocky rise where several ravens perched upon bare branches, utterly still despite the strengthening wind. "They've been watching us since morning," she whispered. Garrett laughed uneasily and remarked the ravens watched everyone. Then one of the birds tilted its head with slow deliberation, opened its beak, and uttered not a caw, but a clear, human cry for help. Every horse shied at once. The cry came again, unmistakable now. "Help us," it called in the voice of a frightened man. "Brothers, help!" Another raven answered with the same plea, though its voice sounded older, cracked with pain. Then all 7 birds began repeating the words together, each using a different human voice. The sound rolled through the silent forest until it became impossible to tell where one voice ended and another began. Clay's weathered face turned as pale as the snow around him. "Those are the missing rangers," he whispered. "Gods preserve us." Without warning, every raven launched into the air. They circled above the travelers once before flying north in perfect formation, disappearing beyond the trees. Their borrowed voices faded with them, leaving an emptiness somehow more unsettling than the cries themselves. Garrett crossed himself repeatedly, while even Vera stared after the birds with troubled eyes. Alaric remained motionless, remembering old tales shared beside Castle Black's hearth by brothers too old to fear ridicule. Men claimed the Greenseers could speak through ravens, but those stories belonged to another age. Whatever had spoken through those birds had carried no trace of mercy. They made camp before darkness settled completely, choosing a small clearing protected by great boulders, crusted with ancient ice. Fire came reluctantly from damp wood, producing more smoke than flame, but none dared travel farther after sunset. Alaric ordered watches in pairs, despite their dwindling numbers. No man should face the northern darkness alone. While Garrett gathered fresh branches, Vera sat sharpening her long knife against a smooth stone, each slow scrape carrying through the stillness like the ticking of some invisible clock. As the meal of salted venison warmed over the flames, Alaric finally asked the question that had haunted him since leaving the ruined camp. "Tell me about your brother." Vera kept her eyes fixed upon the blade resting across her knees. "Torin is 19, she replied after a long silence. "He laughs too loudly, hunts badly, and never remembers where he leaves his spear. A faint smile touched her face before vanishing. Our mother used to say he was born looking at things no one else could see. Clay shifted uneasily beside the fire. "You spoke of cold blood," the old ranger said. "What did your elder mean by that?" Vera hesitated, as though repeating forbidden words might awaken something sleeping nearby. "Old Bryn said our family came from people who lived here before the first men crossed the sea. He said certain bloodlines carried old promises inside them, promises even time could not break." She poked absently at the fire with a stick, sending sparks swirling upward. None of us believed him. He was ancient and spoke more to trees than people. Alaric felt the weight of those words settle heavily upon his thoughts. The old tales of the North were filled with forgotten bloodlines, vanished kings, and bargains made beneath weirwood branches. Most brothers of the Night's Watch dismissed such stories as winter fancies meant to frighten children. Yet strange things walked beyond the wall, and stranger truths often hid beneath legends that had survived thousands of years. If the dead truly hunted one young wildling above all others, there had to be a reason more dangerous than superstition. The first watch passed without incident. Frost crept across shields and saddles while the fire burned lower, filling the clearing with wavering orange light. During the second watch, shortly before dawn, Alaric awoke to complete silence. Not the ordinary quiet of winter nights, but an absolute stillness so perfect that even the wind had ceased to exist. He sat upright beneath his blanket, every instinct screaming at him. Before his mind understood why, the fire no longer crackled. Then somewhere beyond the ring of darkness surrounding the camp, a single footstep pressed gently into fresh snow. Another answered from the opposite side, then another and another, until unseen figures circled the clearing with slow, measured patience. None of them breathed, none of them spoke, yet Alaric knew with dreadful certainty that they were no longer alone. Alaric was on his feet before the others had fully woken, his sword already in hand and the dragon-glass dagger drawn from beneath his cloak. The silence pressing upon the clearing was unnatural, heavy enough to seem almost solid, and every instinct he possessed warned him not to mistake it for peace. Garrett stumbled upright, blinking sleep from his eyes, while Clay fed another branch into the fire with hands that trembled despite years spent ranging beyond the wall. Vera did not ask what had happened. She saw the look on Alaric's face, seized her spear, and turned slowly, searching the darkness beyond the ring of firelight. The footsteps came again, soft enough that another man might have dismissed them as snow slipping from branches. Alaric knew better. Each sound was measured, deliberate, circling closer without haste. Their unseen company wanted them awake. It wanted them listening. The horses shifted nervously, whites of their eyes gleaming whenever the fire flared, and one gelding gave a frightened whine that ended almost as soon as it began. Then a figure emerged between the trees. It was one of the missing rangers. His black cloak hung in frozen strips, and half his face had been peeled away, exposing pale flesh beneath a crust of ice. His eyes burned with an icy blue light that reflected neither fire nor moon, and frost clung to his beard like shattered crystal. He walked stiffly but steadily into the clearing, stopping just beyond the reach of the flames. Behind him, another shape appeared, then another, until 6 dead men stood among the trees in complete silence, their broken bodies illuminated by the fire. Garrett whispered the name of one of them before horror stole the rest of the words from his mouth. "That's Hullen," he breathed. "I trained beside him." The dead ranger tilted his head ever so slightly, as though he had heard. Slowly, impossibly, the corpse smiled. It was not the smile of a man greeting an old friend. It was the empty imitation of something that had forgotten what smiles were meant to mean. "They're waiting," Clay muttered, gripping his spear. "Why aren't they coming?" Alaric studied the edge of the clearing and noticed something that chilled him more deeply than the corpses themselves. None of the dead crossed into the firelight. They stood precisely beyond its reach, as though respecting a boundary invisible to living eyes. Their blue gaze remained fixed, not on the rangers, but on Vera. She noticed it as well. Every corpse watched only her. One of the dead suddenly spoke. Its voice emerged cracked and frozen, like ice breaking beneath a heavy boot. "Where is Torin?" The words were barely human, each syllable forced through lips that no longer obeyed the flesh around them. Garrett recoiled, while Clay nearly dropped his spear. Vera's grip tightened until her knuckles whitened. The corpse waited without moving, then repeated the question in exactly the same tone. "Where is Torin?" No one answered. Without warning, all 6 corpses rushed forward. The charge was terrifying, not because of its speed, but because of its silence. Their boots struck the snow without a sound, mouths open in lifeless determination. Alaric met the first wight with a sweeping cut that shattered its shoulder, yet the creature continued forward, swinging its broken arm with enough force to knock him backward. Garrett buried his axe into another corpse's skull, splitting it nearly in half, but the dead man merely seized the haft and dragged the young ranger toward him. Vera thrust her spear clean through a woman's chest, driving the corpse back into the snow. The woman grasped the shaft with frozen fingers and snapped the ash wood as though it were brittle kindling. Before she could reach Vera, Clay lunged between them, plunging a dragon glass knife into the dead woman's throat. The effect was immediate. Frost exploded outward from the wound, and the corpse collapsed into lifeless fragments, its blue eyes extinguished forever. "Dragon glass," Alaric shouted. "Forget the steel." The clearing erupted into desperate violence. Ordinary blades hacked limbs from bodies that refused to stop moving, while every strike from dragon glass ended a wight forever. Garrett abandoned his axe after it became lodged in a corpse's ribs, drawing the small obsidian dagger from his belt just as another dead ranger seized him by the throat. He drove the black blade upward beneath its jaw. The corpse burst apart in a shower of frozen shards, leaving Garrett gasping upon the blood-stained snow. One wight slipped past the fighters entirely. It ignored Alaric's exposed back, ignored Clay's labored breathing, ignored the frightened horses. It ran straight toward Vera with terrible purpose. She reached for the broken remains of her spear, realized too late it was useless, and drew her hunting knife instead. The dead man slammed into her before she could strike, throwing both of them into the snow. His frozen fingers closed around her wrists with crushing strength. Again the corpse spoke. "Take us to him." Or its voice sounded different now, less broken, almost pleading.
Vera stared into those blue eyes and realized with horror that something else looked through them, something ancient, wearing the dead as easily as a man wore gloves. The creature did not want her dead, it wanted her alive. Alaric threw himself into the struggle, driving his dragon glass dagger deep into the corpse's neck. The white convulsed violently before collapsing across Vera's legs. Together they shoved the body aside, both breathing hard. In the frozen air around them, the remaining dead had already fallen, reduced to scattered limbs and melting frost. The battle had lasted scarcely a minute. Then came the sound that none of them wished to hear. A single horn blast echoed faintly across the forest. It was distant, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. One long note. The call of the night's watch. Gerd looked toward the sound with sudden hope. "Brothers," he said, "someone else is out here." Clay did not share his optimism. His weathered face remained fixed upon the dark forest beyond the clearing. "No," he answered quietly. "Listen." Several moments passed. Then the horn sounded again. One long blast. Exactly the same treat. No pause, no signal, no variation. Again, one long blast. Again, one long blast. The sound continued with perfect, unnatural rhythm, neither growing louder nor softer, repeating without end like a voice trapped inside the mountain itself. Alaric had heard every signal the watch used since he was a boy. No ranger would blow a horn that way. No living lungs could keep such tireless measure. Vera slowly rose to her feet, brushing blood and snow from her cloak. She looked north toward the unseen source of the endless call, her expression darkening with recognition. "My grandmother spoke of this," she whispered. "She said when the dead hunt someone, they send voices ahead of them. They call in familiar tongues until living men walk willingly into the cold." The horn sounded again. One long blast. Closer now. Alaric stared into the forest where the darkness seemed to gather between the ancient pines. Somewhere beyond those trees, something intelligent had begun to guide them. It had tested them with the dead, spoken through borrowed mouths, and now beckoned them onward with the voice of the night's watch itself. He feared they had stopped being hunters. They had become the hunted. They broke camp before the first gray light touched the eastern sky. No one suggested following the sound of the horn, though it continued to echo through the forest with relentless patience. It drifted between the trees like a memory that refused to die, always seeming just beyond the next rise, never truly nearer and never farther away. Alaric ordered the fire buried beneath snow until not a single ember remained. If the dead wished to find them again, he would not leave them a beacon. The horses were failing. Frost rimed their manes, and their flanks quivered with exhaustion after days spent forcing a path through deep drifts. Clay's old mare favored one foreleg, while Garrett's gelding started violently at every fallen branch. Vera walked beside her mount rather than riding, conserving the animal's strength for whatever lay ahead. Alaric noticed she glanced often toward the north, studying the forest with the wary attention of someone expecting to recognize a familiar landmark. At last he asked what troubled her. "There is an old place ahead," she answered without slowing. "My people called it the Hollow Grove. We never entered it after sunset,
and children were beaten if they wandered too close. She stooped to brush snow from a weathered stone protruding from the ground. Strange spiral markings covered its surface, softened by centuries of wind and ice. Old Bryn claimed the trees there remembered names spoken before the first men came. He said the roots carried whispers beneath the earth. She looked up at Alaric, and for the first time uncertainty outweighed defiance in her eyes. The trail is leading us there. Clay heard her words and grew visibly uneasy. I've seen the place once, the old ranger admitted after a long silence. 30 years ago, before Garrett was born, my commander ordered us around it even though the longer path cost us 2 days. He rubbed his gloved hands together as though the memory itself carried a chill. He said there were groves where the old gods listened too closely. A wise man did not linger where ancient powers still remembered their own strength. By midday, the forest began to change once more. Great pines gave way to towering weirwoods, whose pale trunks gleamed against the snow like the bones of giants. Their crimson leaves clung stubbornly to the branches despite the hard winter barely stirring in the windless air. Faces watched from nearly every trunk, some worn almost smooth by time, others so sharply carved they seemed capable of speech. Their red eyes followed the travelers from every direction. Even Garrett, who had always scoffed at tales of haunted trees, lowered his voice without realizing he had done so. The horn had fallen silent. Its absence unsettled Alaric more than the sound ever had. Hours passed without a single unnatural cry, without a raven overhead or a broken branch beneath unseen feet. The stillness seemed deliberate, as though whatever pursued them had decided it no longer needed to hurry. Snow drifted gently between the white trunks, and sunlight filtered through the crimson canopy in faint blood-colored shafts. It was beautiful in a cold, merciless fashion. Alaric found himself wishing for the storm to return. Late in the afternoon, Vera suddenly froze. Ahead, the trees opened into a broad clearing unlike anything Alaric had seen beyond the wall. Dozens of enormous weirwoods formed a perfect circle around an expanse of untouched snow, their branches intertwined overhead, creating a vast crimson roof that shielded the ground below from the falling snow. At the center stood a low hill of dark stone, and upon that hill rose a single weirwood, larger than all the others combined. Its trunk was broader than the towers of Castle Black, its roots twisting across the earth like the coils of some sleeping beast. The carved face upon the ancient tree had no eyes. Where red sap should have flowed from empty sockets, only frozen black scars remained. What happened here? Garrett whispered. No one knows, Vera replied. She spoke almost reverently, as though afraid the grove itself might hear the question. The old stories say the children sang beneath this tree before men ever crossed the sea. Then something came from the far north, and the songs stopped forever. Alaric dismounted and walked cautiously into the clearing. The snow beneath his boots remained perfectly smooth despite the surrounding forest, untouched by birds or beasts or falling branches. There were no tracks of deer or wolves. No rabbit had crossed the open ground. Nature itself seemed to avoid the place. Then he noticed the stones. Half buried around the great tree stood 12 weathered monoliths, arranged in a broad circle. Their surfaces bore carvings so ancient that time had nearly erased them, yet enough remained to reveal strange symbols, unlike the runes of the first men. Alaric brushed snow from the nearest stone. The carving depicted a tall figure surrounded by smaller kneeling forms, while above them spread a crown fashioned from jagged ice. Clay came beside him and stared silently. "I've seen that shape before," the old ranger murmured. "Where?" "In the deepest vault, beneath Castle Black." Alaric looked at him sharply. "There are old stones down there," Clay continued, his voice barely audible. "Most brothers ignore them. They're older than the wall itself. I remember one carving, only a fragment, but the crown was the same." Neither man spoke for several moments. The wall had stood for 8,000 years, built after the long night to separate the realms of men from whatever horrors lay beyond. If symbols like these existed beneath its foundations, then whoever carved them had known of the enemy long before the wall rose from the earth. A sudden cry shattered the silence. Vera had climbed partway up the stone hill and now stood frozen beside one of the great roots. Alaric hurried toward her, sword drawn, expecting another ambush. Instead, he found her staring at something lying half-concealed beneath a blanket of snow. It was a man. He still breathed. His beard was thick with frost, his clothes stitched from heavy furs, unlike those worn by any clan Alaric recognized. One leg bent unnaturally beneath him, and dried blood stained the front of his cloak. Yet it was not his injuries that held Alaric's attention. His wrists had been bound with chains made entirely of ice. Not frozen iron. Ice itself? The links glimmered faintly blue, hard as steel, without melting despite the touch of living hands. The stranger's eyes fluttered open. For an instant, panic filled them, and he struggled weakly against the impossible chains. "They're coming back," he rasped, his voice cracked with exhaustion. "They thought I would die before anyone found me." Alaric knelt beside him. "Who are you?" The man swallowed painfully before answering. "My name is Harl." His gaze darted fearfully toward the eyeless weirwood towering above them. "I escaped." Vera frowned. "Escaped from whom?" Harl's face drained of what little color remained. "Not whom." He turned slowly, looking north beyond the grove where the forest vanished into endless white wilderness. "From what waits beneath the ice." Before anyone could ask another question, a deep rumble rolled through the earth. Snow slid from branches all around the clearing. The ancient weirwoods creaked together, not in the wind, but from something moving beneath their roots. Then from somewhere deep below the frozen ground, there came a sound unlike anything Alaric had ever heard. It was the slow, deliberate cracking of immense ice, not breaking. The sound beneath the earth lingered long after it had ceased, leaving every man straining to hear the next crack. None came. The grove returned to its unnatural stillness, yet the silence had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. Alaric rested one hand against the hilt of his sword while his eyes searched the great weirwoods surrounding them. The carved faces seemed different now, not because the wood had changed, but because he could no longer dismiss the feeling that they were watching with purpose. Harl tried to sit upright, but pain forced him back against the exposed root supporting his shoulders.
His beard was rimed with frost so thick that it cracked when he spoke, and his lips had turned a pale blue that no ordinary winter could explain. Clay knelt beside him with a skin of watered wine, lifting it carefully to the wounded man's mouth. Harl swallowed only a little before pushing it away. "Save it," he muttered.
"You'll need more than warmth before this is done." His gaze drifted toward the icy chains around his wrists, and a look of shame crossed his face. "Don't waste time trying to break these. I already did." Garrett crouched beside the strange bindings, tapping one frozen link with the pommel of his dagger. It rang like forged steel. He struck harder, then harder still, but the chain remained untouched. Alaric drew his dragon-glass knife and pressed its edge against one of the links. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a faint hiss escaped the ice, and a thin line spread across its surface before vanishing again, as though the chain had healed itself. Harl gave a tired laugh that held no amusement. "The black stone wounds their work," he said, "but whoever forged those chains gave them more strength than a single blade can steal." "You said you escaped," Alaric replied. "Escaped from where?" Harl closed his eyes for a long moment, gathering strength that seemed to slip away with every breath. "There are caves north of here," he said at last. "Older than the wall, older than the kingdoms of men. We found them while hunting mammoths. After a harsh winter drove the herds farther than ever before." He paused, swallowing hard. "My clan thought we had discovered shelter. We found a prison instead." No one interrupted him. Even the horses had gone strangely quiet, lowering their heads as though reluctant to disturb the ancient grove. "The caves were filled with frozen halls," Harl continued. "There were pillars carved from blue ice that never melted, and beneath them stood figures trapped inside the walls themselves. Some looked like men, others—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish. "We believed they were dead until the whispers began. Every night someone heard a familiar voice calling from deeper inside. A wife heard her husband. A child heard his mother. We followed those voices one by one." "And the people who followed?" Vera asked quietly. "They never returned." A gust of wind swept through the grove, stirring crimson leaves overhead. The sound resembled countless hushed voices speaking at once. Alaric glanced toward the eyeless weirwood, unable to shake the feeling that the tree itself was listening. Harl drew a shaky breath before speaking again. "On the 6th night we saw them. White shadows moving beneath the ice walls, watching us without blinking. They never attacked. They waited." His hands tightened uselessly against the frozen chains. "Then one morning, our strongest hunter walked out of camp before sunrise. He never spoke a word. He simply walked into the darkness as though answering an old promise." Harl looked directly at Alaric. "By dusk he came back. His eyes were blue." Garrett looked away, his face paling. He had fought whites before, but hearing the slow unraveling of living men struck some deeper fear within him. The dead were terrible enough. The thought that the living could be drawn willingly toward such a fate was worse. "They didn't kill us all," Harl said. "That was never their purpose. They searched through us." He tapped his own chest with bound hands. "Every prisoner was questioned, though not with words. They looked into your eyes, and memories came flooding out whether you wished them or not. Families, names, blood.
His breathing quickened. Whenever they found the answer, they sought, they moved on. Whenever they failed, the prisoner joined the dead. Alaric exchanged a grim glance with Clay. "Torin," he said. Harl nodded. "They're looking for someone. Every captive they questioned carried a different memory, but always they searched the same thing. A bloodline. An old family hidden among the free folk." His gaze shifted toward Vera. "If your brother bears that blood, then every dead thing north of the wall will hunt him until the world ends." Vera's expression hardened, but grief lingered beneath her resolve. She remembered Torin as he truly was, laughing too loudly around the evening fire, missing rabbits with arrows that should have struck true, pretending confidence whenever their mother scolded him. The stories of ancient blood had always embarrassed him. He had rolled his eyes whenever old Bryn spoke of forgotten kings or older pacts. He had wanted nothing more than an ordinary life among his people. Now those old tales had become the reason they were all walking deeper into the lands of death. The rumble beneath the earth returned. This time it came from the northern edge of the grove. The snow there lifted almost imperceptibly before settling again. One of the horses screamed and tore free from its tether, bolting between the weirwoods with wild terror. Garrett lunged after it, shouting, but the frightened animal vanished among the white trunks before anyone could stop it. "Horse!" Garrett cried. "I'll bring him back." "No," Alaric barked. The warning came too late. Garrett disappeared into the trees, his black cloak flashing between the pale trunks, before the forest swallowed him whole. The others stood frozen, listening. For several heartbeats, there was nothing but the whisper of leaves overhead. Then Garrett shouted again, not in fear, in confusion. "I found someone." Alaric ran toward the voice with Vera close behind him. The grove seemed larger than before, its ancient trees crowding together in impossible ways that made distance difficult to judge. They rounded a massive trunk and found Garrett standing motionless beside a low drift of snow. A child stood before him. The boy could not have been more than 8 years old. His clothes were stitched from old furs, faded by age, and his bare feet rested upon the snow without leaving tracks. His cheeks were flushed with healthy color despite the bitter cold, and long brown hair fell across bright gray eyes. He smiled at Garrett. "You took a long time," the child said gently. Garrett frowned. "Where are your parents?" The boy ignored the question. Instead, he looked past Garrett directly at Alaric. "I remember you." Every ranger in the clearing stopped breathing. Alaric had never seen the child before, yet the certainty in the boy's voice admitted no mistake. "You were here once," the child continued, "a very long time ago." The words settled over the grove like fresh snow. Vera stared from the child to Alaric in bewilderment. Clay slowly reached for the dragon-glass knife at his belt. The boy's smile widened ever so slightly. Then his eyes changed. Gray became blue. Not gradually. Not naturally. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, they became the cold, brilliant blue of living ice. No one moved. The child's smile remained gentle, almost innocent, but the blue in his eyes held no trace of youth. It was an ancient gaze, patient beyond reckoning, as though countless winters had passed before it without leaving the smallest mark. Alaric felt every instinct urging him to strike, yet his sword remained lowered. There was something profoundly wrong about the boy standing before them. He did not breathe. Frost did not gather on his hair. Even the falling snow curved around him without ever touching his skin. Clay was the first to act. With a sharp cry, he drew the dragon-glass dagger from his belt and lunged. The blade swept cleanly through the child's chest without resistance, as though it had passed through mist. The boy did not flinch. He merely watched the old ranger with quiet curiosity while the dagger emerged from his back, untouched by blood. Clay stumbled forward in disbelief, nearly falling to one knee. The child tilted his head and said softly, "Steel cannot cut a memory." The boy dissolved before their eyes. His body did not collapse or shatter. It unraveled into a cloud of pale frost that drifted upward among the crimson leaves before vanishing into the branches overhead. At the same instant, every carved face upon the surrounding weirwoods released a thin stream of red sap. It flowed slowly from their eyes like fresh blood, staining the white bark in winding trails. Gerd staggered backward, crossing himself again and again, while Vera whispered an old prayer in the tongue of the free folk. The grove answered. A low murmur spread beneath the earth, so faint that at first it seemed no more than the wind. Then words began to form inside the sound. They came from every direction at once, spoken in dozens of voices, layered together until none could be separated from the others. Some sounded like old men, others belonged to women, children, or warriors. Alaric caught only fragments as the whispers passed through the roots beneath his feet. Keeper. Blood. Promise. Vessel. The voices faded as quickly as they had come, leaving only the creaking of ancient branches above. Harl's face had gone white with terror. "It knows," he rasped as Alaric hurried back toward him. "I prayed we had slipped past its sight. But it knows we entered the grove." He struggled uselessly against the frozen chains once more. This place was never abandoned. The children made it to remember, and now something else remembers through it. He swallowed hard before forcing out his next words. "If we stay until nightfall, none of us will leave." Alaric looked toward the lowering sun. The gray light filtering through the canopy had already begun to fade, though evening remained some hours away. Winter shortened every day beyond the wall, and darkness came swiftly. "Can you walk?" he asked Harl. The wounded man laughed bitterly. "With these?" He lifted his bound wrists a few inches. "Not far." Clay examined the icy chains again, his weathered fingers tracing the strange frozen links with growing frustration. "There must be a way," Garrett insisted. "Everything made can be broken." Clay shook his head, perhaps by the hands that forged it. He reached into his pouch and withdrew 3 small pieces of dragon glass, black and sharp as fresh broken night. "Help me lift the chains." Together they wedged the obsidian beneath 2 of the links and pressed with all their strength. At first, nothing happened. Then a thin crack spread across the ice, accompanied by a hiss, like water falling onto hot iron. The chains trembled violently. The crack widened. A brilliant blue light burst from inside the broken link. Every piece of dragon glass in Clay's hands became coated in white frost before exploding into glittering shards. The force hurled both rangers backward across the snow. Harl cried out as the chains snapped taut once more, entirely unbroken. His wrists bled where the frozen links had tightened,
but the ice itself remained flawless. "It punishes anyone who tries," he said through clenched teeth. "I've watched stronger men lose their hands." Before anyone could answer, the frightened horse that had fled earlier emerged from between the trees, or what remained of it. The mare walked slowly into the clearing, her hide crusted with ice and her eyes glowing the same cold blue as the dead. Great wounds covered her flanks, exposing frozen flesh beneath torn skin, yet she moved without pain. She stopped 20 paces away and stared directly at Alaric. Behind her came another horse, then another. They were not theirs. Their tack was ancient, cracked by age, and patches of long frozen leather clung to skeletal frames. Each beast stood silently waiting. "They're not attacking," Garrett whispered. "No," Alaric replied. "They're leading." As though understanding his words, the first horse turned and began walking toward the northern edge of the grove. The others followed in perfect silence. None looked back. Their hooves left no prints in the untouched snow. Within moments they had vanished between the weirwoods. Vera stared after them with narrowed eyes. Torin used to follow wounded deer instead of healthy ones, she said quietly. He always believed the easiest trail hid the deepest pit. She met Alaric's gaze. "Those things want us to chase them." "I know. But if they took him north?" "I know." The choice settled over the company like another layer of snow. Ignore the trail and risk losing Torin forever, or follow it into whatever trap had been prepared. Alaric had commanded men long enough to recognize impossible decisions. Sometimes survival depended not upon choosing the safer road, but the one that left a chance, however small, of ending the danger at its source. A sharp cry echoed through the grove. Not from the forest, from the great eyeless weirwood. Every head turned toward the ancient tree standing upon the stone hill. Its massive trunk shuddered once, and a long crack spread across the bark. From root to branch, red sap poured from the wound in thick streams, steaming where it struck the snow. The sound came again, deeper this time, and Alaric realized, with mounting dread, that it was not the tree making the noise. Something inside it was trying to get out. The bark split wider. A pale hand emerged through the opening. Its fingers were impossibly long, each tipped with translucent nails that glittered like ice. Slowly they gripped the edges of the broken trunk and pulled. Harl's voice broke into a panicked shout. "Run!" No one hesitated. Alaric seized Harl beneath one shoulder, while Clay took the other. Vera and Garrett hurried ahead, clearing a path through the weir woods as the great tree groaned behind them. Branches cracked high overhead. The earth shook beneath their boots. None dared look back until they had reached the edge of the grove. When Alaric finally turned, the ancient weirwood stood silent once more. The wound in its trunk had vanished. No hand remained. Only one thing had changed. Across the smooth white bark where the split had been, fresh letters had appeared, carved so deeply they bled crimson sap. Vera read them first. Her face drained of color. "It knows his name," she whispered. Alaric looked at the tree. The words had been written in the old tongue. Even so, he understood them. Bring Torin. They did not stop running until the hollow grove had vanished behind walls of pine and drifting snow. Every man expected to hear pursuit crashing through the forest, yet none came. Only the rasp of their own breathing disturbed the silence, while Harl stumbled between Alaric and Clay with the frozen chains dragging across the snow. Twilight settled over the haunted forest in slow, colorless waves, and the first stars appeared through rents in the cloud. Alaric finally called a halt beneath an outcrop of black stone where the wind could not easily reach them. No one spoke for several moments. They listened, hoping to hear nothing. Garrett was the first to break the silence. "Those words on the tree," he said, still struggling to steady his breath. "How could you read them?" Alaric stared into the gathering darkness before answering. "I don't know." The admission tasted bitter. "I have never learned the old tongue beyond a few names and commands the free folk use. Yet when I looked upon the carving, I knew every letter." Clay frowned deeply, but said nothing, while Vera watched Alaric with quiet concern rather than suspicion. Beyond the wall, there were mysteries older than memory, and men sometimes carried pieces of them without ever knowing. They built no fire that night. The risk was too great. Instead, they wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks and chewed strips of frozen venison, while the horses stood close together for warmth. Harl leaned against the rocks, his wrists raw beneath the icy chains, and closed his eyes for a time. When he spoke again, his voice had grown steadier. "There are stories among my people," he said, "old stories that no one repeated unless winter had already claimed half the clan." He lifted his head slowly. "They said the White Walkers were never searching for kingdoms. They searched for families." Vera looked at him sharply. "My grandmother told much the same tale," she admitted. "She said certain bloodlines vanished during the long night because the others hunted them until none remained." She hesitated before continuing. "Old Bryn believed ours survived only because our ancestors abandoned their true name. Every generation forgot a little more until only a handful of old tales remained." Her eyes drifted toward the north. Torin laughed whenever Bryn spoke that way. He said dead kings could not climb out of graves. Harl gave a weary nod. "They need more than kings?" The words settled over the little camp with uncomfortable weight. "They need someone living." Alaric felt the pieces beginning to fit together, though he disliked the picture they formed. The dead had ignored stronger prey. They had spared prisoners who possessed no useful memories. They had crossed forests and slaughtered entire clans to seize one young hunter who knew nothing of ancient blood. Whatever power the others sought could not be taken from the dead. It had to remain alive. Near midnight, Clay took the first watch. The old ranger climbed onto a low ridge overlooking the camp, spear resting across his knees while snow drifted lazily through the darkness. Years beyond the wall had taught him patience. Most dangers announced themselves only to men willing to wait. Hours passed with nothing but the sigh of winter moving through distant branches. Then, far to the north, a pale light flickered once against the horizon. Clay narrowed his eyes. The light came again. Not fire. It was too cold. A narrow blue beam reached briefly into the sky before fading away. Moments later, another answered farther east, then another. Soon half a dozen pale lights appeared across the distant wilderness, rising and falling in slow rhythm like beacons answering one another across an unseen sea. None remained visible for more than a heartbeat. Yet together they formed a rough line stretching toward the mountains of the Frost Fangs. Clay woke Alaric at once.
The younger ranger climbed beside him and watched the strange lights dance across the northern horizon. "I've never seen that before," Alaric murmured. "See, I have." Alaric turned in surprise. Harl had climbed the ridge despite his injuries, his chained wrists hanging heavily before him. "They guided us," he said quietly. "The first night after we entered the caves, every hunter who followed those lights disappeared before dawn." His expression darkened. "We believed they marked safe paths. They marked gathering places." "For whom?" Harl did not answer immediately. "For the dead." Morning came, beneath a sky the color of worn steel. Snow had ceased during the night, revealing a wilderness swept clean by bitter winds. Their tracks stretched behind them in an unbroken line leading back toward the hollow grove. Alaric expected to find signs of pursuit. Instead, he found none. No footprints. No broken branches. Nothing. It was as though no creature had crossed their trail since they departed. Vera crouched beside the tracks, studying them in silence. After several moments, she brushed fresh snow across one footprint, hiding it from sight. "They don't need our trail anymore," she said. "They know where we're going." Alaric frowned. "We don't." She stood slowly. "They do?" The realization chilled him more deeply than the morning air. Every choice they believed their own might already have been anticipated. Every path north narrowed toward the same destination. The dead had stopped chasing because there was no longer any need. Like hunters driving deer toward hidden archers, they had allowed fear itself to guide their quarry. By midday, the forest began climbing into rougher country, where broken cliffs rose above narrow valleys choked with ancient snow. Great walls of stone forced the travelers onto winding paths scarcely wide enough for a single horse. Here the wind returned with savage force, carrying sharp crystals that stung exposed skin. More than once, Alaric thought he glimpsed figures standing atop distant ridges, pale against the dark rock, but each vanished before he could be certain they had ever been there. Late in the afternoon, they reached the mouth of a narrow pass. Black cliffs rose on either side, their faces glazed with ice that reflected the dim winter light. The entrance looked little different from countless ravines scattered across the frost fangs, save for one detail. Someone had built a cairn. Flat stones had been stacked carefully beside the trail, reaching nearly to a man's waist. Such markers were common among the free folk, guiding travelers through dangerous country. This one bore a single object resting upon its highest stone. A raven, recently dead. Its breast had been opened with clean precision. Inside the empty cavity where its heart should have been lay a small piece of obsidian. Dragon glass. Alaric picked it up carefully. The stone was warm, not merely free of frost. Warm. Before anyone could speak, a voice echoed from somewhere deep within the pass. "Sir Alaric?" It was unmistakable. "Lord Commander Mormont. Dead these many years." The voice came again, calm and commanding. "I know the way." Every face turned toward the shadowed gorge. No one stood there. Only darkness. Waiting, no man answered the voice. Alaric remained where he stood, the warm shard of dragon glass clenched tightly in his gloved hand while the narrow pass stretched before them like the throat of some slumbering beast.
The words had been spoken exactly as he remembered them from years before, carrying the same steady authority that had guided frightened recruits into seasoned rangers. That familiarity made them all the more dangerous. Lord Commander Mormont had died south of the wall.
Whatever had called his name now was borrowing a memory, not a living man. Alaric forced himself to breathe slowly until the pounding in his chest eased. The voice came again, softer this time, as though the speaker had stepped deeper into the shadows. "Alaric, bring the others. We found shelter." Garrett took one uncertain step toward the pass before Clay caught his arm with surprising strength. The old ranger's eyes never left the darkness ahead. "Don't chase ghosts," he said quietly. "Ghosts always know the names you wish to hear." Garrett swallowed hard and nodded, though shame colored his face. He had known Lord Commander Mormont only briefly, yet even that short acquaintance tugged painfully at his heart. Vera approached the cairn and examined the stones one by one. Unlike the weathered markers built by the free folk, these rocks had been cut into clean, deliberate shapes. Their edges were too sharp, too perfect, as though they had been carved only yesterday, instead of enduring centuries of winter. Near the base she found a faded symbol scratched into the lowest stone, almost hidden beneath a crust of ice. It resembled two circles joined by a single line, enclosed within a larger ring. Harl saw it and immediately turned pale. "I've seen that mark," he whispered. "Where?" Alaric asked. "In the caves." Harl stared at the symbol as though it had become a venomous snake. It was carved above every chamber where prisoners were kept. Those who entered beneath it never returned. They left the cairn untouched. Alaric slipped the warm piece of dragon glass into his pouch, unwilling to abandon the only thing that seemed untouched by the bitter cold. Then he led the company into the pass. Towering cliffs closed around them, blotting out much of the gray sky until only a narrow ribbon of light remained overhead. The walls were covered with ancient ice, clear enough that strange shadows seemed trapped deep within it. More than once, Garrett thought he saw faces looking back at him from beneath the frozen surface. Whenever he blinked, they were gone. The path climbed steadily northward. Wind no longer reached them, yet the air grew colder with every 100 paces. Their breath drifted in long white streams that lingered unnaturally before slowly sinking toward the ground. Even the horses seemed reluctant to continue. Alaric's mare stumbled twice without apparent cause, ears flattened against her skull while she stared into the still air ahead. Harl noticed it as well. "They smell it?" he murmured. "They smell what?" Garrett asked. "The cold that isn't winter." "You?" No one spoke after that. Near midday, the pass widened into a basin surrounded by cliffs on every side. Snow lay untouched across the valley floor, interrupted only by enormous slabs of dark stone rising from the earth like broken teeth. At first, Alaric believed them to be natural formations. Then he noticed their arrangement. The stones formed 2 long rows, leading toward a broad staircase carved directly into the mountainside. Half buried beneath centuries of snow, the steps disappeared into a vast opening of blue-black ice. The entrance was easily 60 feet high. No fortress of men had ever possessed such a gate. Vera stared in silence. "This place wasn't made for us." Harl nodded. It was waiting long before the first men crossed the sea. As they approached, Details emerged from beneath the ice. Great pillars flanked the entrance, each carved with twisting patterns unlike any craft Alaric had seen. Between them stood weathered statues whose features had been almost erased by time. Some appeared vaguely human. Others possessed long limbs and narrow faces, unlike any race known in Westeros. Their empty eyes watched the travelers pass without judgment. The cold pouring from the entrance carried no scent. That absence struck Alaric more sharply than any smell could have done. Every cave possessed odors of damp stone, earth, or stale air. This place smelled of absolutely nothing. It was as though the cold itself had consumed every trace of life that had ever entered. Just inside the entrance, they found the first body. The man had died kneeling. His heavy fur cloak was frozen into the ice beneath him, and both hands remained wrapped around the hilt of a shattered bronze sword. Snow had not touched him despite the open gateway. His flesh had dried rather than rotted, preserved by impossible cold, until his face still carried the expression of grim determination with which he had met death. Beside him lay the remains of a wooden shield bearing no sigil Alaric recognized. Clay knelt beside the corpse. Not free folk. No, Harl agreed. My grandfather spoke of people who lived farther north than any clan does now. They vanished generations before I was born. Alaric looked more closely at the dead warrior's armor. Bronze scales covered his chest, while his cloak had been fastened with a brooch shaped like a weirwood leaf. Everything about him spoke of an age so distant that no songs remained to remember it. Yet one thing was unmistakably familiar. A dragon-glass dagger rested beside his right hand. Its blade had been snapped neatly in half. They ventured deeper. The light faded quickly, replaced by a pale blue glow seeping from the walls themselves. The ice was astonishingly clear. Buried within it were branches, leaves, stones, and countless tiny air bubbles suspended like stars in a frozen sky. Here and there, darker shapes lurked beyond the translucent walls, too distant to identify. Alaric found himself staring at them despite knowing he should not. The tunnel opened into a hall, vast enough to swallow Castle Black's great hall several times over. Pillars of solid ice rose toward a ceiling lost in darkness, while the floor reflected every movement like polished glass. Along both sides stood rows of stone alcoves carved into the walls. Some were empty. Others contained figures sealed behind clear sheets of ancient ice. Men, women, children, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Each appeared frozen in the instant before death. Some reached desperately outward. Others knelt in prayer. One old man still clutched a bundle wrapped tightly against his chest, protecting it even after countless centuries. Gerd stared in horror. "They're alive." "No," Harl answered. "They were." His voice echoed strangely through the enormous chamber. "They become part of the place." As they moved cautiously between the frozen alcoves, Alaric noticed that every preserved face was turned in the same direction, toward the far end of the hall. There, beyond ranks of towering pillars, stood a pair of immense doors fashioned entirely from blue ice. Unlike the rest of the cave, those doors bore no frost. They gleamed with unnatural clarity. Across their surface stretched the same symbol Vera had found upon the cairn. 2 circles, 1 line, 1 enclosing ring. The mark of a prison. Or perhaps
a seal. Then from somewhere beyond the great doors came a sound that froze every soul where they stood. It was not the tread of the dead, not the whisper of wind. It was the slow, steady beating of a human heart. One beat, a long pause, then another, powerful enough that the ice beneath their boots trembled with each pulse. The heartbeat echoed through the frozen hall with dreadful patience, each pulse rolling beneath their feet before fading into the endless corridors beyond. No living heart could have been heard from such a distance, yet there it was, steady and impossibly strong. Alaric instinctively counted the seconds between each beat. They were long enough to make him wonder whether the thing beyond the doors truly lived at all. Every pause invited hope that it had stopped forever. Every new beat destroyed that hope. No one spoke until the fourth pulse had passed. "It wasn't there before," Harl whispered, his voice barely carrying across the polished ice. "When my people found these halls, we searched this chamber. We heard whispers, we heard voices. Never that." He stared at the immense blue doors with the expression of a man recognizing a nightmare he had once escaped. "Something has awakened." Clay walked carefully toward one of the frozen alcoves lining the wall. Behind the clear ice stood an elderly woman wrapped in heavy furs, her hands clasped tightly around a carved wooden staff. Frost covered her eyelashes, yet her expression remained strangely peaceful, as though death had found her in prayer rather than terror. At the base of the alcove, almost hidden beneath centuries of ice, Clay noticed a row of ancient runes. He knelt, brushing away frost with his glove. "They're not names," he murmured. Alaric joined him. "What do they say?" Clay studied the worn markings for several moments before answering, "I cannot read them all." His finger traced one symbol after another. "But this one means guardian. This one," he hesitated. "I think it means offering." Vera had moved farther down the hall, examining the silent faces trapped within the ice. There were too many to count. Some wore bronze armor, like the dead warrior at the entrance. Others dressed in rough animal skins or robes stitched from woven bark. They'd come from different peoples and different ages, yet every one of them had ended here. She stopped before a young woman whose face resembled her own enough to steal the breath from her lungs. The likeness was not exact, but the shape of the eyes, the high cheekbones, the dark hair braided with strips of leather, it was enough to stir something deep within memory. "Alaric!" Her voice shook. He crossed the hall and followed her gaze. The frozen woman's neck bore a pendant carved from white weirwood. Upon it had been etched the same spiral pattern Vera had shown them days earlier on the weathered stone near her ruined village. "My grandmother wore that mark," Vera whispered. Her fingers hovered inches from the ice without touching it. "She said it belonged to our family long before anyone remembered why." "You were..." Harl slowly approached. He looked first at the pendant, then at Vera. "I told you they searched for blood." A terrible understanding spread across his face. "They've been searching for generations?" The heartbeat sounded again. This time it was followed by another noise. Footsteps. Not hurried. Not concealed. Someone was walking beyond the great blue doors. Each measured step matched the rhythm of the unseen heart. Step. Beat. Silence. Step. Beat.
Silence. The sound drew closer until it seemed the unseen figure stood immediately beyond the frozen barrier. Then it stopped. For several long moments, nothing happened. The silence grew so complete that Garrett found himself holding his breath without realizing it. A voice emerged from the other side of the doors. It belonged to Torin. Vera. She spun toward the sound before anyone could stop her. His voice was weak but unmistakable. "I'm here." She hurried across the polished floor, tears filling her eyes despite every warning reason could offer. "Torin." "I'm cold," the voice answered. So cold. Alaric caught her arm before she reached the doors. She struggled against him with surprising strength. "He's alive." She pointed desperately toward the ice. "Can't you hear him?" "I hear him." "Then let me through." His grip tightened. "No." She glared at him with fury. "That's my brother. And if it truly is, he has survived this long." Alaric kept his eyes fixed upon the doors. "If it isn't..." He left the thought unfinished. The voice came again. "Deuwa." Closer now. So close, Vera. A pale shape appeared behind the translucent blue ice. At first it was only a shadow. Then the outline sharpened into the unmistakable form of a young man. Torin. His face was bruised, his clothing torn. One arm hung uselessly at his side. He leaned heavily against the inner surface of the frozen doors, looking directly at them. His eyes were brown, living, filled with desperate hope. "Please." His voice cracked. "They're coming back." Vera's resolve shattered. She tore free of Alaric's grasp and ran the remaining distance. Her palms struck the smooth ice with a dull thud. "Torin." The young man smiled weakly. "I knew you'd find me." He lifted one trembling hand and pressed it against the opposite side of the barrier. Only a sheet of blue ice separated brother and sister. Vera matched his hand with her own. The instant their palms aligned, every torch they carried went out. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Only the blue glow of the great doors remained. The heartbeat quickened. For the first time since entering the caves, it no longer sounded distant. It beat beneath their feet. The polished ice floor cracked. Thin black lines raced outward in every direction like lightning across a frozen lake. The frozen people within their alcoves opened their eyes. Not blue. Red. Hundreds of silent crimson eyes turned toward Vera. The voice that spoke next no longer belonged to Torin. It emerged from every frozen mouth at once. "You carry the blood." The heartbeat became thunder. A blinding blue light burst from beneath the cracked floor. The immense doors began to open. Not outward, inward, as though something on the far side had finally been invited to enter. The doors parted only a hand's breadth at first, yet the cold that poured through the opening struck with the force of a winter gale. It carried no snow, no wind, and no scent of ice. It was emptiness given shape, a cold so absolute that the torches did not merely fail to burn, they blackened where they lay, their wood turning brittle beneath a skin of white frost. Alaric staggered back one step, his lungs refusing to draw a full breath.
Around him, the great hall groaned as ancient ice answered the slow movement of the doors. The heartbeat beneath the floor continued, faster now, each pulse sending fine cracks racing across the polished surface. Vera tore herself away from the door, just as a long, pale hand reached through the widening gap. It was not the hand that had emerged from the weirwood in the hollow grove. This one belonged to a living thing, if living it could still be called. Its fingers were slender and graceful, almost beautiful, yet every nail ended in clear ice, sharp enough to cut stone. The hand rested lightly upon the edge of the doorway, making no attempt to seize anyone. It simply waited, as though confident that fear alone would accomplish what violence could not. Then a voice spoke from beyond the doors. Not loud, not threatening. "Bring me the sun." Every frozen prisoner lining the hall lowered their heads at once. The movement happened with perfect unity. No hesitation, no sound. It was as if an unseen command had passed through every body in the chamber at the same instant. Harl fell to one knee, not in obedience, but because his strength had nearly abandoned him. His chained wrists shook violently as he stared at the narrow opening between the doors. "I heard that voice once before," he whispered. It questioned every prisoner without raising its tone. His breathing became ragged. When it finished, half my people walked willingly into the darkness. Alaric looked toward the blue-lit gap. He had expected rage or madness or the cruel delight of some ancient monster. Instead, he heard only terrible certainty. Whatever waited beyond the doors did not doubt the outcome. It did not threaten because it believed threats unnecessary. The hand slowly withdrew. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then someone else stepped into view. Torin. He emerged from the darkness behind the doors, exactly as Vera remembered him. His dark hair hung across his brow, one sleeve had been torn away, and dried blood stained the front of his fur cloak. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, just as Harl had described the captives dragged north through the snow. Yet there was warmth in his face, color in his cheeks, and tears standing openly in his eyes. "Vera," his voice trembled. "I thought I'd never see you again." She stood frozen between hope and fear. "Torin." He nodded quickly. "It's me." His gaze swept across the others before returning to his sister. "They couldn't break me." He smiled faintly. "They kept asking about Father's father, about our blood. I told them nothing." Vera searched his face desperately. She saw the scar beneath his chin where he'd fallen from a pine as a child. She saw the crooked nose he'd broken fighting another hunter 2 winters before. Every mark belonged to her brother. "What did Mother call you?" she asked suddenly. "When you stole food before supper?" Torin blinked in surprise. Then he laughed softly. "Little Bear." Vera's shoulders sagged. Only family knew that name. Tears filled her eyes. She took one slow step toward him. Alaric caught her cloak before she reached the threshold. "Wait!" Torin looked at him with open frustration. "There isn't time. There is enough." Alaric never took his eyes from the young man. "If you're truly Torin, tell me what stands behind those doors." The smile faded. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Torin's face.
Don't know. You came through them. I don't remember. Alaric's grip tightened on his sword. What is the last thing you remember? Torin closed his eyes. The camp, his brow furrowed. The dead came before dawn. He struggled to continue. They carried me north. His voice faltered. There was ice, a hall, whispers. Then he looked up. I woke here. Harl slowly shook his head. No. Everyone turned toward him. No prisoner wakes. His face had become as pale as the surrounding ice. They never let us wake. Torin's expression darkened. You don't know what happened to me. I know enough. Harl forced himself upright despite the chains weighing upon his wrists. I watched my own brother walk out through those same doors. His eyes locked upon Torin. He remembered our mother. He remembered every scar on my face. He smiled exactly as you smile now. Silence settled over the chamber. Harl swallowed. It wasn't him. Torin's features hardened. For the first time, anger flickered across his face. You would rather leave me here? I would rather save the living. The heartbeat beneath the floor became faster still. Cracks spread around Torin's boots. Blue light seeped upward through them. He looked down, then back toward Vera. They're waking? His voice had changed, only slightly. It carried a second tone beneath the first, deeper and colder than any human throat should have produced. Please. Come. The frozen prisoners lifted their heads once more. This time they all smiled. The expressions were faint, almost gentle, yet none reached their eyes. One by one they stepped forward. The ice imprisoning them shattered without a sound. Hundreds of figures emerged from the alcoves, moving with slow, measured grace. Not whites, not living men, something between. Their skin remained pale and untouched by decay. Their eyes glowed a dim, icy blue beneath lowered brows. Each wore clothing from a different forgotten age. Bronze armor, animal skins, woven bark, ancient cloaks stitched with feathers. Every generation that had vanished into these caves now walked together. None carried weapons. None hurried. They simply advanced in silence, surrounding the travelers from every side. Alaric drew his sword. Clay and Garrett formed beside him. Vera stood torn between the approaching host and the brother waiting beyond the half-open doors. Then from the darkness behind Torin, another figure appeared. It was taller than any man. Its armor looked as though it had been carved from living ice. Each plate clear enough to reveal pale blue light flowing beneath the surface. A long sword rested in one gloved hand, its edge so cold that frost spread across the floor wherever its tip passed. No crown adorned its head, yet authority surrounded it more surely than gold or jewels ever could. It stopped behind Torin. One hand settled gently upon the young man's shoulder. Torin did not resist. He did not even seem to notice. The figure's blue eyes rose to meet Alaric's. No hatred lived within them, only purpose. Then it spoke. You have brought me the sister. The words echoed through the hall. And soon, its gaze lingered upon Vera. I shall have the vessel.
The words hung in the frozen hall long after the voice had fallen silent. No one mistook their meaning. Whatever stood beyond the doors had never cared whether Torin lived or died. He had been bait, nothing more, a familiar face meant to draw the last surviving bearer of an ancient bloodline across the threshold. Alaric felt a cold anger settle where fear had been moments before. The trap had been laid long before any of them were born, and they had walked into it one careful step at a time. The tall figure took a single step forward. Frost spread outward beneath its feet in delicate branching patterns, racing across the polished floor until they reached the boots of the nearest frozen prisoners. At once, every pale figure halted, lowering their heads as if awaiting command. The being did not rush them. It regarded the company with the calm certainty of a lord inspecting travelers who had arrived precisely when expected. Torin remained motionless beneath the creature's hand, staring at Vera with pleading eyes that no longer seemed entirely his own. "You seek to cross the wall," Alaric said, forcing his voice to remain steady. The figure inclined its head ever so slightly. "The wall stands." "So it does." "You cannot pass it." "Not as I am." The answer was simple, almost conversational, and that frightened Alaric more than a boast would have. The creature neither denied nor exaggerated its purpose. It merely stated a fact. "The children bound this flesh to ancient ice," it continued. "The chains they forged endure. Stone, spell, memory. Every winter weakens them, yet they remain." Its gaze shifted toward Vera. "A living vessel ends what they began." Harl stared in disbelief. The stories were true. "They were fragments," the figure replied without looking at him. "Men remember endings. They forget beginnings." Vera tightened her grip on the broken shaft of her spear until the wood creaked beneath her fingers. "What do you want with my blood?" she demanded. The creature regarded her for several long moments before answering. "Nothing." Its voice remained calm. "It is not yours." Those words struck Vera harder than any blade. Memories flooded back without warning. Old Bryn insisting that names had been changed, her grandmother refusing to answer questions about ancestors older than 3 generations, her father avoiding every tale of their family's beginnings whenever winter fires burned low. She had dismissed them all as harmless stories meant to entertain children. Now every forgotten conversation returned sharpened by terrible purpose. "You descend," the figure continued, "from the last keeper." The heartbeat beneath the floor sounded again. Long, powerful, patient. "When the children understood they could not destroy me, they entrusted the binding to one bloodline. Each generation inherited what the last refused to remember." Its eyes never left Vera. "Memory fades. Blood does not. I'll eat." Clay slowly reached into his pouch. Alaric recognized the movement at once. Every remaining piece of dragon glass. The old ranger met Alaric's eyes only briefly before giving the smallest nod. Then he hurled the obsidian shards across the chamber. Black stones struck the polished floor around the icy figure instead of the figure itself. For an instant, nothing happened. Then every shard burst into brilliant, crimson flame. The fire spread not through wood or oil, but through the ancient runes carved beneath the clear ice. Hidden lines blazed into existence across the entire hall,
weaving between pillars and alcoves in an immense circle that no one had seen before. The blue glow dimmed. The heartbeat faltered. The tall figure recoiled. For the first time, surprise crossed its face. "The ward," Harl whispered. It was always here. The runes flared brighter. Ancient symbols raced outward beneath every frozen prisoner. One after another, the pale figures stopped moving. Their empty expressions softened. Some lowered their heads. Others simply closed their eyes, as though falling into peaceful sleep after centuries of waiting. Fine cracks spread across their icy flesh. The being's calm finally broke. "You do not understand what you awaken." Its voice echoed through the chamber with gathering force. "The ward is failing." It always was. Clay drew the last dragon glass dagger from his belt. "I don't need it to last forever." With a cry that echoed beneath the towering ceiling, he drove the black blade into the largest blazing rune at his feet. The chamber erupted. Light exploded upward from beneath the ice. The great pillars trembled. Cracks spread through the immense blue doors behind the tall figure, each fracture glowing with deep crimson fire. The heartbeat became erratic, stumbling like that of a dying giant. Above them, enormous sheets of ancient ice broke loose from the ceiling, crashing onto the polished floor in thunderous bursts. "Clay!" Garrett shouted. The old ranger looked back only once. His weathered face held no fear, only quiet acceptance. "Take them!" Another deafening crack split the hall. One of the towering pillars collapsed. Clay shoved Alaric backward with surprising strength. The falling pillar struck him before another word could be spoken. Ice and stone swallowed the old ranger in an avalanche of glittering fragments. His dragonglass dagger vanished beneath the collapse. The rune beneath it blazed brighter still. The tall figure staggered. Its icy armor fractured across one shoulder, revealing not flesh beneath but swirling darkness laced with pale blue light. It lifted one hand toward Vera, yet the blazing runes forced it back another step. For the first time since entering the caves, Alaric saw genuine urgency in those ancient eyes. "Go," Harl roared. Alaric did not hesitate. He seized Vera's arm, while Garrett lifted the wounded Harl beneath one shoulder. Together they fled toward the entrance as the hall came apart around them. Behind them, the frozen prisoners crumbled quietly into drifting snow. Their long imprisonment finally ended. The great blue doors continued to crack from top to bottom, crimson fire pouring through every widening fracture. As they reached the mouth of the chamber, Vera looked back. Torrance still stood before the shattered doors. For a single heartbeat, the blue haze clouding his eyes cleared. He smiled at her. It was the same crooked, embarrassed smile he had worn since childhood whenever he knew he had done something foolish. Then he turned. Without looking back again, he wrapped both arms around the tall figure and drove it backward through the broken doors. The heartbeat stopped. An instant later, the mountain itself began to collapse. The mountain roared like the end of the world. Ice split apart in every direction, and great slabs of frozen stone crashed through the collapsing halls behind them. Alaric threw himself over Vera as a wave of shattered crystal burst from the tunnel, carrying dust, broken pillars, and centuries of frozen air into the open valley. Garrett dragged Harl toward the entrance with every ounce of strength left in his exhausted body, while the horses screamed outside, rearing against their reins. The earth shuddered beneath them, then lurched again, as though something vast deep within the mountain had finally broken free of its ancient prison. They burst from the great gate just as the cliffs above began to collapse. Entire shelves of rock sheared away, plunging into the basin below with deafening force. The towering entrance disappeared beneath an avalanche of snow and black stone that swallowed the immense blue doors forever. A cloud of glittering ice rose into the pale winter sky, blotting out the sun for several long moments. When the thunder finally faded, only silence remained. Where the ancient gateway had stood, there was now nothing but a broken mountainside buried beneath thousands of tons of frozen earth. No one spoke. Alaric slowly climbed to his feet, his ears still ringing from the collapse, and turned toward the shattered mountain. Somewhere beneath all that stone lay Clay, who had stood his ground when every other man had fled. Somewhere beyond him lay Torin, whose final act had been his own choice rather than the will forced upon him. Alaric removed his black glove and pressed his bare hand against the cold snow. The Night's Watch buried few of its dead beneath proper cairns beyond the wall. Winter itself became their grave. He bowed his head only once before rising again. Vera remained where she had fallen, staring at the mountain without blinking. Tears froze upon her cheeks before they could reach her jaw. She had found her brother only to lose him again within the span of a few desperate moments. Yet the last thing she had seen was not a puppet wearing his face. For a heartbeat, Torin had truly returned. He had recognized her. He had chosen. That single moment became a small flame against the endless cold gathering inside her heart, fragile enough that she feared even speaking his name might extinguish it. Harl was the first to notice the change. The chains. His voice was little more than a whisper. Everyone looked toward his wrists. The frozen links had become dull and gray. Fine cracks spread slowly across their surface before the impossible ice crumbled into ordinary frost, falling harmlessly onto the snow at his feet. Harl stared at his freed hands as though he had forgotten what it meant to move them. He flexed stiff fingers, rubbed warmth back into his raw wrists, and then looked toward the ruined mountain with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "The prison still stands," he said quietly. Alaric frowned. "The mountain fell? The prison did not." Harl pointed toward the broken slope. "It was never stone." The words lingered between them. Alaric understood before Harl explained further. The caves had not been the prison. The ancient wards, the bloodline, the sacrifice of forgotten generations, all had existed to restrain something far older than the halls themselves. The collapse had sealed the entrance and strengthened the failing bindings for a time. It had not destroyed what lay beneath. Ancient magic did not die as easily as walls of ice or towers of stone. They began the long journey south before nightfall. None wished to remain another hour beneath the shadow of the shattered mountain. The return proved no easier than the path north. Fresh snow covered familiar trails, and the forest seemed determined to erase every sign that men had ever walked there. Yet one thing had changed. The endless feeling of being watched had vanished. No pale figures stood upon distant ridges.
No voices called from among the trees. Even the unnatural silence had lifted. Ravens flew overhead once more, and before the second day they heard wolves howling somewhere far across the hills. The wilderness remained dangerous, but it belonged to itself again. When they reached the hollow grove, they found another change awaiting them. The great eyeless weirwood still towered above the clearing, its pale branches stretching toward the winter sky. The crimson leaves had all fallen, covering the snow like scattered drops of blood. The terrible wound that had once opened in the trunk was gone, and so were the carved words demanding Torin's return. In their place remained only weathered bark, untouched by fresh cuts. Alaric approached cautiously and laid one gloved hand against the ancient wood. The tree was warm, not with the warmth of fire, with the faint living warmth of sap still flowing beneath bark despite the deepest winter. Vera stepped beside him. Without speaking, she removed the weirwood pendant taken from the frozen woman in the cave and placed it gently among the tree's exposed roots. For a long while nothing happened. Then a cold breeze stirred the fallen crimson leaves, carrying them upward in a slow spiral around the ancient trunk before they settled once more. No voices followed, no visions came. The grove had accepted what was returned to it. Many days later, the wall finally appeared through the drifting snow, rising above the wilderness like the edge of another world. The brothers at Castle Black stared in disbelief as the weary survivors emerged from the northern forests with only 3 horses and stories. No sensible man wished to believe. Alaric gave his report exactly as duty required. He spoke of the lost ranging, the slaughtered wildling clan, the dead that walked, and the mountain that had collapsed. He did not speak of the ancient bloodline or the words exchanged beyond the blue doors. Some truths, once written into ledgers, became invitations for fools to seek them. In the years that followed, strange tales continued to drift south with the winter winds. Hunters claimed the haunted forest had grown quieter. Wildlings spoke of forgotten paths, reopening through the frost fangs where no dead thing had been seen for a generation. Others insisted that, on the coldest nights, a faint blue light still flickered deep beneath the broken mountain before vanishing again beneath the snow. Most dismissed such stories as fear carried from one campfire to the next. Alaric never did. Some victories were not final. They merely purchased time. On certain winter evenings, when the wind struck the wall with enough force to make the ancient ice groan, Alaric would remember the calm voice beyond the frozen doors. He would remember the words spoken without anger, without hatred, with nothing but absolute certainty. A living vessel ends what they began. He often wondered whether Torin's sacrifice had delayed that fate by years or by centuries. There was no answer to be found, only duty. So the Black Brothers kept their watch. The free folk endured another generation beyond the wall, and the old prison slept once more beneath mountain and ice. Far below the shattered peaks of the far north, where no living foot could now reach, darkness settled over the buried halls. Broken stone sealed every passage. Crimson fire had faded into blackness. The ancient heartbeat was silent. Then, after a long while, measured not in days but in winters, a single crack spread quietly through a block of clear blue ice. From somewhere beyond it, unseen in the endless dark, 2 pale blue eyes opened. If you follow the histories of Westeros long enough, you begin to understand that the greatest dangers rarely arrive with banners flying or dragons filling the sky. They begin with forgotten promises, abandoned places, and names that no one remembers because remembering has become too painful. Men build walls, swear sacred vows, and crown kings believing stone, steel, and power can hold back every darkness. Yet George R. Martin's world has always reminded you that the oldest battles are not won by fortresses alone. They endure because ordinary people, often unknown to history, choose to stand their ground when no songs will ever be written for them. You have watched Alaric, Vera, Clay, Harl, and Torrin walk the same hard road that so many others have walked throughout the ages of Westeros. None of them sought glory. They wanted only to protect a brother, keep a vow, survive another winter, or make sense of stories their elders barely believed themselves. In another tale, they might have become heroes, welcomed into great halls. But this is a harsher world, where courage usually asks for everything a person has before offering anything in return. Honor is never free here. It is measured in graves left behind and faces remembered long after the snow has buried every footprint. Blood, in the end, is both blessing and burden. Families inherit more than names, lands, or the color of their eyes. They inherit forgotten debts, broken oaths, and ancient responsibilities carried silently from one generation to the next. Torrin never asked to become the last link in a chain forged thousands of years before his birth, just as Vera never wished to discover that her family had been guarding a secret larger than kingdoms. Yet this is the quiet cruelty that lives beneath the history of Westeros. The past is never truly past. It waits patiently beneath castles, beneath forests, beneath mountains of ice, until someone living is forced to pay the price of what others began. Perhaps that is why the wall has always meant more than frozen stone. It is not simply a barrier against monsters. It is a promise renewed every day by men who know they may never see the reason for their sacrifice. The brothers of the Night's Watch stand because someone must stand. The free folk endure because someone refuses to kneel before despair. Even the oldest magic in the world depends, in the end, upon human choices. No ancient power can erase the quiet strength of a single person who decides that another shall live, even if they themselves do not. When you leave this story behind, the kingdoms of men continue as they always have. Lords still quarrel over crowns. Ravens still carry tidings from castle to castle, and children still grow beside hearth fires without knowing how close the long night has come. Far beyond them all, the haunted forest waits beneath another falling snow. The pines bend beneath the weight of winter exactly as they did at the beginning, their branches whispering to one another in the endless cold. Somewhere beyond the wall, where the sky bleeds white into the silent trees, a lone rider disappears once more into the storm, and the wilderness closes quietly behind him.